Thank you for joining us this evening. This is a discussion about Virginia's independent cities. I'm Douglas Jackson, and Marissa can't be with us tonight, but she sends her regards. And I'd like to just kind of couch this a little bit. We've been on a journey with some of our readings. We read, last we read the City Plan 2040, and there were questions about it and comments about the independent city structure in Virginia and the role that it plays in keeping areas segregated and disparities of income between communities. And so we thought we'd dig a little bit deeper. Chris Chittum was our guest in one of the sessions, and he pointed to that as kind of as a piece of Virginia's policy that continues to affect us as an independent city. And so we thought we'd go deeper. And tonight we've got David Conmy with us. And David is one of my, until very recently, he was a compatriot with me at Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And David so now formally, he was the local government policy administrator for the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. And he staffed the Commission on Local Government and prepared advisory reports for legislature and dug deep into this issue. He also worked with the 21 planning districts in the Commonwealth. And he, prior to that, was a planner and demographer for Henrico County. And now, currently, he is the Deputy County Administrator and the Economic Development Lead for Sussex County. David is an inaugural member of the Better Housing Coalition's Young Professionals Board, a founding member of the Churchill Central Civic Association, and a member of the Policy Advisory Committee for Housing Opportunities Made Equal. That's HOME. And some of you may have been part of a great presentation that HOME did as part of programming from points of diversity in our community, maybe within the past 2 years. David holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia School of Architecture. And David enjoys spending time with his husband, Justin, and their dogs in the Churchill neighborhood in Richmond, where they have lived for more than 15 years. So David, thank you for spending time with us tonight. We're really looking forward to the conversation. This will be pretty informal. We'll give you a little chance to make some comments, and then we'll turn it over to some questions and answers.
So as Doug had mentioned, in my up to a month ago, I worked at DHCD in the local in the Policy and Legislative Office as the local government policy administrator for the Commission on Local Government. I was there for a period of 8 years, and then prior to that, 8 years with Henrico County. So lots of local government experience, and again, educational background in urban planning. And so I suppose I will just dive right into the study. These are going to be kind of just very informal remarks, but what I thought I would do is just kind of take you through everything that unfolded as the Commission on Local Government embarked on this study. And I suppose what I'll start off with, this will be kind of out of order, but it'll make sense to some degree. And that is when I, within a year and a half of joining DHCD and joining the Commission on Local Government, we were entering into one of those wild and crazy General Assembly sessions. And one subject that comes up quite regularly before the General Assembly is Virginia's annexation moratoria. And when I talk about the annexation moratoria in plural, obviously, I'm talking about really three different matters. One is, of course, the moratorium on independent cities being able to annex a surrounding county or counties. And there's also a moratorium on counties being able to declare themselves fully or partially immune from independent city initiated annexation. And then 3, a moratorium on the creation of new independent cities in the Commonwealth, essentially a transition of a town into being an independent city. And so the reason those moratoria come up frequently is because of a provision in state statute, which was essentially known as the Annexation Compromise. And I'll dive into a little bit of the history of local government formation that leads up to this Annexation Compromise in just a moment. But essentially, this compromise that the General Assembly worked out was, as long as they funded localities with police departments, not sheriff's offices, but police departments, at a statutorily prescribed funding level, then the annexation moratoria would remain in perpetuity. However, money being what it is, and members of the General Assembly not necessarily always being attuned to the needs of their local governments, they have underfunded police departments. It's called 599 funding. They've underfunded that for a number of years. And to get around this statutory obligation, they have carved out exceptions in state code. And so you can literally see the statute. I can't think of the code section off the top of my head, but if you look at it, you'll see each biennium listed that they have carved out. And so again, the moratoria was about to go up again, like the biennium was approaching. And so there was an interest by Delegate Tony Wilt, who is from the Harrisonburg-Rockingham area, and Senator Emmett Hanger, who's also from Shenandoah Valley area, Stanton, Augusta, Waynesboro, and other surrounding areas. They wanted to look at the moratorium, and it was actually at the request of a local government official about what can be done to the annexation moratorium. How can we get around this? How can we, stop inserting additional biennia as exceptions to this otherwise obligation? And anecdotally, when the study was first introduced as a bill before the General Assembly, they extended the annexation moratoria for over 10 years and would have requested the Commission on Local Government to conduct a study over the course of those 10 years on this particular subject matter. So what had been shared with me by some of the study stakeholders early on was, when they initially floated that 10-year period of time, that really speaks to how serious, or perhaps the opposite of serious, they were about this study. This was just something that was, in some people's minds, arbitrarily picked as a period of time. We would have gone through essentially 2.5 governors' administrations, probably at least 10 different commissioners on our Commission on Local Government, et cetera. I mean, we would still be working on the study to this day. So that was already somewhat telling about how serious they were about this. But despite all of that, staff and the Commission on Local Government members assembled what I thought was a pretty impressive A-team of advisors from all over the state to help inform us on how to conduct this study. We were required to include representatives from the Virginia Municipal League and the Virginia Association of Counties, but then we also selected others, including Kelly Harris Braxton, the executive director of Virginia First Cities, which is more of your traditional urban cities in the Commonwealth, cities like Hampton, Norfolk, Portsmouth, Richmond, and several others are represented by Virginia First Cities. We had Dickie Cranwell, who actually hails from y'all's general region, and Carter Glass. They are kind of the two celebrities from the many annexation wars that occurred in the Commonwealth over the years. Mr. Cranwell oftentimes represented county interests, while Mr. Glass represented cities. We also invited pairs of cities and counties to help inform us from their perspective on the annexation moratoria in Virginia. And what we did was we invited those cities and counties that were not currently immune, meaning that the surrounding county had not declared itself statutorily immune from annexation, and the city would be eligible for annexation if the moratoria was lifted. So we invited the city of Harrisonburg and Rockingham County, and then the city of Emporia and Greensville County. We also had several other more regional level bodies inform the study, including David Blunt from the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission, but he also represents all PDC interests across the state. And of course, we invited John Meeser, who I know was the author of one of the other pieces of literature that Doug circulated with you all in advance of tonight. And so, again, quite an A-team of experts. And early on, when we were working on this study, let me back up. The study was essentially given 4 tasks. We were to evaluate the structure of cities and counties in the Commonwealth, evaluate the impact of annexation upon localities, consider alternatives to the current moratoria on annexation by cities, and then consult with VACO and VML, which are the Virginia Association of Counties and Virginia Municipal League, on the study. So early on, when we were working on the study, I was still fairly fresh and kind of naively thought, okay, well, let's do some local government 101 and kind of, make sure that everybody in the stakeholder advisory group really knew, all of the various taxing powers and structural organization matters of cities and counties in the Commonwealth. But very quickly learned that they wanted us to kind of cut to the chase and focus on other important matters, especially from a fiscal perspective. But nevertheless, the study does speak to the history of local government formation in the Commonwealth, because I found that to be context and historical perspective really matters. The interesting thing about that in Virginia, and that I learned through the course of this study is, Virginia, one, if you looked in the study in one of the appendices, you can see that Virginia starts off with its original 8 shires in 1611, Henrico County being one of them. I'll just speak to them since I worked for them. But gradually you see new county boundaries established over time. Generally, those local governments were assigned responsibility that was fairly basic in nature, essentially just public safety and welfare, especially when we were under the rule of the Crown before our own independence. But again, the general rule of thumb for establishing these local boundaries was essentially no one should be more than 1 day's horse ride from their local courthouse for conducting business with the government, which seems like a fairly reasonable and practical approach for local government formation. And of course, you can see that in some of those maps in the appendices, it starts, really on the eastern end of Virginia, and then you have some counties form that are broad and expand westward into, fairly uncharted territory. And that pattern continues on and on and on and on. And at one point, Virginia encompassed territory that comprised 8 different states. It extended as far west into portions of Minnesota. So it's just staggering to think of one, Virginia being that size at this point in time, but then two, just again, thinking of the logic behind settlement patterns, service delivery needs, and utilizing that proximity and accessibility to local government, the government that is closest to the people, for service delivery, and making sure that it, again, was accessible for your average citizen. And so that thought pattern, it continued into the 1880s, and I believe it was 1882 was the last year that Dickinson County in Western Virginia was created. And then absent local government consolidations, which have occurred since that time, and absent annexations that have occurred since that time, and absent reversions that have occurred since that time, local government structure in Virginia has been largely undisturbed, which, if you think about what's happened since the 1880s to 2022, a lot has happened, and certainly begs the question for are local government boundaries, even if drawn in a way that is conducive to and complementary to local government service delivery. So that's a big question. Fast forward into the early 1900s, and you have I believe the first mention of Virginia's cities being independent, but I believe it wasn't until the 1970 or 71 Virginia Constitution where Virginia officially recognizes its cities as independent. And by that, I mean that an independent city is completely separate from its surrounding or overlapping county or counties. In fact, there is no overlap. They don't share a revenue tax base. They don't, by default, share local government service delivery responsibilities. They have separate school divisions. The citizens of those communities feel largely part of that one community and not any other community. And so with annexation being what it was, and with what was occurring in our country at the time, really after World War II, with federal programs being created to provide free and affordable housing to certain soldiers returning from war, white soldiers returning from war, not Black soldiers, and the advent of the federal highway system, and the cheap land that was available in previously surrounding countryside, and sort of the desire to leave the city and live in the suburbs. You had a mass exodus of people leaving traditional central cities and the dawn of the suburbs, and that, generally speaking, was an erosion of the tax base of many traditional central cities in America, not just in Virginia. And so cities traditionally would try to keep up with that expansion because they are the ones providing urban services, which are generally a higher level of service to their citizens, such as utility services. Most municipal governments provide those. Police forces, most municipal governments provide those. Planning and zoning, community development, whereas counties, especially more rural counties, are governed by general law and are not required to provide that higher level of service. So instead you have a sheriff's department. You generally don't have a utility system. You generally don't have a police department. And so, again, those services are still being provided, but the local governments have to pay for that in some way. And so as the tax base is eroding away, cities were trying to keep up with that through annexation. And of course, there are a number of other issues that were at play and that Dr. Meeser's book speaks to in particular with segregation and race in Virginia and diluting minority voting power strength. So all of these things are just unfolding over, really the 1950s through the 1980s. And cities and counties are at war with each other and spending millions of dollars in costly legal battles to justify the annexation that they are trying to proceed with or defend themselves from. And so the General Assembly initiated several studies on the matter over the course of, those decades, and came up with a number of recommendations. Some included temporary moratoriums on city-initiated annexation, and others started calling for, we need some sort of independent advisory board to review annexations and advise the judicial branch, which is the branch that ultimately decides annexation cases. We need somebody to advise the judicial branch on whether or not an annexation should occur or not. And so that was actually the foundation of the Commission on Local Government, which again, I recently worked for. We also had recommendations for looking at matters on a more regional basis, trying to get localities to cooperate and collaborate together. And that was sort of the recommendation of the Hahn Commission, I believe. And that was the advent of planning district commissions. But all the while, you still have these disputes occurring. And in 1987, the General Assembly enacted a moratorium on city annexation, and again, county declaration of immunity from annexation and the formation of new independent cities in the Commonwealth. And so since that time, many traditional central cities had already been struggling, but now we're struggling even more because they no longer had the opportunity to grow their boundaries. They were, relegated to growing from within, and many have gotten very creative and successful in addressing those needs. But nevertheless, it's oftentimes challenging, especially if you think of segregation, Jim Crow laws, white flight, and many other matters that have essentially concentrated poverty in traditional central cities in America and in Virginia, and more prosperous, affluent communities, surrounding counties that don't have those increased service delivery demands, and to a much wealthier tax base. And so while all of this is unfolding and while the commission is reviewing all of this information, the city of Petersburg was undergoing a fiscal crisis, And in fact, they were, well, one, Virginia does not allow its local governments to declare bankruptcy, but if they had that constitutional authority, they probably would have pursued that. And their issues weren't necessarily exclusive to a weak, impoverished tax base, but it was more so a fiscal management issue for the city of Petersburg that got them into their crisis. But nevertheless, you do have a traditional central city, majority minority community that had already been struggling and was continuing to struggle and was now at the brink of fiscal collapse. And so that particular topic really was or not topic, that particular event, because it occurred while we were working on the study, caused us to focus on fiscal stress, local government fiscal stress, which is something that the Commission on Local Government measures. I won't go into any exhaustive detail of fiscal stress, but it's essentially three measures of cities and counties in the Commonwealth. It's median household income, it's revenue capacity, which is a measurement of how much revenue a city or county could generate if it taxed its citizens at statewide average rates, and then revenue effort, which is how much their revenue capacity they are actually collecting. And to use an analogy, revenue capacity is like an orange. So there's only a certain volume of juice in any given orange. A revenue effort is how much are we squeezing that orange relative to our peers. In many cases, especially with cities, revenue effort is exceedingly high and much higher than the calculated capacity for those communities. And that makes a degree of sense with everything that I've already shared from an historical perspective. You have an exodus of wealth, an erosion of your tax base. Those that remain in many of these communities require a higher and greater variety of services, social services, housing services, public safety, etc. And the local government is constrained with how it can or cannot grow. And so the only way to really resolve that is to raise taxes and pay for those services, other than also receiving a sufficient level of funding by the state. And so anyway, fiscal stress became a big topic and a big theme for this study. And what we decided to do was measure the fiscal stress of cities and counties in the Commonwealth and compare that to the cost of delivering mandated services at the local level. And we compared that from a local cost and a state cost. And so you can see that also in the appendix that we produced in the report. But generally, many of your traditional cities in the Commonwealth, again, have elevated levels of fiscal stress, but are also relative to their peers not receiving necessarily a sufficient level of funding from the state to support that mandated service delivery. And so we just thought that was rather compelling. We only looked at one particular year of data to conduct that analysis. If we had had more time, we would have done a trend analysis to just see if that held true. And I certainly would hope somebody would pick up where we left off on that and continue that study or continue that examination. And so, gosh, I know I've kind of rambled a lot here. I have a tendency to do that. But through our discussions, through looking at fiscal stress matters, looking at what is available to local governments to encourage cooperation or coordination, and then, quite frankly, recognizing the reality of the matter at hand with the annexation moratorium. Our study recommended that the annexation moratoria be made permanent. And again, if you'll recall at the beginning of my remarks, I shared with you that they were requesting us to produce a study over the course of 10 years. There was a lot of skepticism as to the sincerity of the members of the General Assembly and powers that be, that, were they going to follow through with our recommendations? They just gave us a 10-year study. That just doesn't make sense. Normally, legislative studies that are given to state agencies normally are about 2 years in length. So a great degree of skepticism there. And also recognizing the balance of power in the General Assembly. County interests are definitely outweigh or outmatch city interests. Just on a pure numbers count, the number of legislators representing counties is greater than those representing cities. So the reality of lifting the annexation moratoria in Virginia is low, very unlikely. So recognizing that, we decided that we would recommend that the moratoria be made permanent in exchange for a number of other different recommendations that could help local governments cooperate and achieve greater economies of scale, especially so that they could resolve many of the local fiscal stress matters that they were experiencing. And so, for example, we made recommendations to change the local government consolidation statute, which requires a voter referendum, which is a very difficult obstacle to overcome. We wanted to see additional funding granted to planning district commissions, which are the regional bodies that are required to look at issues of greater than local significance. We wanted to see planning grants given to local governments so they could study greater operational efficiencies. We wanted to, again, create programs that were specifically designed to address local government fiscal distress, among many others. We concluded our study. I want to say that we finished in 2018, and there was legislation that was introduced by Delegate Wilt to carry some of our recommendations, but not all of them, to the General Assembly. And it being what it was, some of our stakeholders were already opposed to what Delegate Wilt recommended, because most of the recommendation hovered around making the annexation moratoria permanent. He did include some of our other recommendations, such as allowing cities that revert to town status to retain city in their title, and instead of being a town, they would have some sort of other status where they could still be considered a city, but not an independent city, and a few others. But again, my memory escapes me as to all of the ones that he put forward, but it was not enough to convince our stakeholders, especially VML and VACO, to support the bill. And in fact, I think they convinced Delegate Wilt to withdraw his bill. So it's a daunting, exhausting, and depending on your interest level, it can be boring or it can be exciting. But it's all of those things. And the matter is what it is to this day. Local government structure is still essentially, in my opinion, frozen in time, yet many of the matters that have afflicted many of our traditional central cities in the Commonwealth and in this country still remain. There have been plenty of examples of cities that have used a lot of creativity and drive to overcome these obstacles. Roanoke is certainly a great example of that. The city of Richmond, my hometown, certainly another great example, but then there are many others that continue to struggle, such as the city of Martinsville, which used to be the sweatshirt capital of the world. Most textiles and a lot of furniture manufacturers were located there. It was an industrial powerhouse, and Martinsville just went through the reversion process and even had Henry County at the table with them all the way through until the very last minute. Henry County pulled out of the agreement, did not adopt the agreement, and is now actively seeking legislation to amend the reversion statute so that a voter referendum would have to occur first before Martinsville could revert to being a town. And I know I didn't explain it, but something like reversion is kind of it's the pressure release valve for a highly fiscally stressed, highly impoverished community like Martinsville. Without that pressure release valve, they're going to have to raise taxes and cut services because they are still going to be mandated to provide their own K-12 school division, among a number of other very costly locally mandated services that they can't get out of, but are required to do. Well, I shouldn't say they can't get out of, but it's an obstacle to get out of, and they are required to do so as an independent city. So it will be interesting to see where something like that goes. I know that there's active litigation. You have the General Assembly inserting itself while active litigation is occurring, which is generally a big faux pas, as I understand. But it's reminiscent of what I've heard from the annexation wars of decades ago, where just, the General Assembly would try to intervene. Cities were in active, costly legal battles against one another, cities and counties. It's just a mess. I have rambled on probably now for 30 plus minutes. I will open the floor for questions or comments if anybody has any. Looks like a question from Sandra Pratt. Sandra, please go ahead.
Yeah, this is all very fascinating because I think, like you said earlier, I think people are either bored to tears by this or fascinated by it, and I'm one of the people who are fascinated by this. But what other states other than Virginia is this the scenario? Like, are we unique in this? Because I thought I knew that there's one other state that is in the same situation that we are with this.
Oh gosh, I'm so glad you asked that question because I forgot one of my local government 101, Virginia local government 101 comments, and that is, of all 50 states, Virginia is the only state in the nation where all of its cities are independent cities. There are 3 other independent cities in the US. That's Carson City, Nevada, St. Louis, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. But then every other city, you essentially have, it's like pancakes, stacked pancakes. They're both sharing, the county and the city are sharing that tax base and coordinating their services where they overlap. It doesn't mean that Virginia localities don't always do that. There's plenty of examples of regional authorities and contractual services that are shared between localities, but it's not the norm, and it's certainly not the standard. You have to actually intentionally do that, and politics being what it is, it's not always easy to convince a governing body to do that. One thing that somebody told a joke during the study, and it was, what's the most difficult animal to kill in Virginia? And the answer was the high school mascot. And oftentimes when you have these communities, especially communities where people have been born and raised, they played football or softball or whatever, and they're like, well, y'all are the Trojans and y'all are the Vikings, and no, we are never going to cooperate with y'all. That trickles into adulthood, and then when they're representing their district and their locality, they're not always amenable to cooperating. I see a question from Bill Bestpitch.
Yes, well, I wanted to comment a little bit about how I think the Roanoke Valley has been affected over the last 30 years or so by what you've been talking with. And I really appreciate you taking the time, David, to explain a lot of this to folks. My wife and I moved from Chesterfield. Excuse me, I would usually just say Richmond, but we didn't live in Richmond. We lived in Chesterfield County. So we moved here in the spring of 1990 to the city of Roanoke. And that November, there was a referendum on the ballot to combine the city of Roanoke and Roanoke County into one governmental unit. And the majority of the voters in the city voted in favor, and the majority of the voters in the county voted against. So it didn't happen. Part of a lot of the impact of that, I think, was that the city of Roanoke decided they really needed to get serious about something that they'd been trying to do in the previous decade. From in the early 80s on, Center in the Square was created. They were really trying to uplift the downtown market area. And that was the same time in early 1990s when this idea of greenways was just getting started. So the city said, we really need to get serious about some of this stuff. And by the early part of the 21st century, we're working on getting a medical school and a research institute to come into the city of Roanoke. So I think that a lot of the impetus for those things resulted, at least in part, from the fact that consolidation didn't happen. And on the other side, we've had much more success with regional cooperation over, especially I would say, the last 20 years, starting with the drought in the early 2000s that resulted in the formation of Western Virginia Water Authority. So now we have a combined water system with the city and Roanoke County, and we have parts of Bedford County and parts of Botetourt and so forth that are also part of that water system. And there are a lot of people who think that that may never have happened if the Roanoke County Board of Supervisors was constantly concerned that the city's going to cooperate with us on some project, and then they're going to try to gobble up more of Roanoke County and annex it into the city because of the project that we just worked together on. So it's allowed people to be more comfortable with regional cooperation in some respects. My question is, what do you see, maybe, I don't know how much you look around the country, but what are going on in other states in terms of cities annexing? Are there still a lot of cities that are annexing? And then the other side of it is, what do you think the appropriate population number should be for independent cities? Martinsville's, I think, now down fewer than 13,000 people. That's not a very big tax base to work from for all the things that you were just mentioning. So what do you think that number should be? Two different questions, sorry.
Sure, no, of course. Would you mind repeating the first question again?
Well, the first question is about what's going on in other states. Are cities around the country actively doing lots of annexation, or is that something that really isn't happening much anywhere else across the country?
So generally speaking, I know that it does still occur, and I think it is still opposed in other states, but I don't know specifically well enough to answer that in a way that would be so definitive. But I mean, I see, or I saw, I should say, plenty of news articles speaking about annexation in other states. And I think it does still bring on that same adversity or adversarial nature. But again, it's the double whammy in Virginia because of that independent nature of our cities. I mean, the county loses that territory forever. And so it's yeah, it's just the third rail of local government relations, or at least it was in Virginia, and you don't have that in other states. So I don't think it's quite as vehemently opposed. And then your next question was on population size. What's an ideal population size for?
What do you think the minimum should be, or what number makes sense to have independent city?
Sure.
So I guess the most recent one in our area, Clifton Forge, reverted back to town status a few years ago, and now is part of Allegheny County, but Covington is still an independent city.
Yeah. So interestingly, early on in some of our research on the annexation study, there was a paper I came across, and I want to say that it was essentially kind of like a bar graph, and you had population on the x-axis, and efficiencies and economies of scale improved greatly and essentially plateaued, I believe, at a population of 250,000. And then after that, really just kind of plateaus and actually in some cases gets worse. And so in thinking of 250,000 as sort of your ideal, I think you kind of work back from that and think of a number that would be ideal for a city to be able to sustain itself independently. And I believe the General Assembly at one point in time thought 125,000 was a good, safe number, and that probably I would tend to agree. I think you need a lot of people in order to have that economy of scale, because you've got to hone in on specific service deliveries that are required of local governments. So, for example, K-12 school divisions. If you're a city like Martinsville and you have a population of 12 or 13,000 people, with that tax base, how are you ever going to be able to afford a teacher that specializes in computer coding and computer programming, or a teacher that specializes in a language that isn't French or Spanish, but is instead something that's a little more unique, but still enriching for the students? You just can't make it work. But then when you get to a larger size, like 125,000 or 250,000, it starts to stabilize, and you can pay for that. So that was a very long-winded way of saying 125,000 to 250,000. I see in the chat, there's also a question from Richard Fife, and I'll just read it for the group. Are we stuck with this system? Doesn't the system in other states work better? How are we ever going to get out of this situation? Why would counties vote to change our current system if they can use the city's services without paying for them? Wow, that's a lot. I think the part of your question that I would like to hone in on in particular, Richard, is the last part. Why would counties vote to change our current system if they can use the city's services without paying for them? One thing, and we speak to this a little bit in the study, and again, I'll be speaking to this from a Richmond example, or Richmond perspective, is again, now that cities have been landlocked, they can't grow. They've had to get creative with what they're doing and within their boundaries. So they're growing up. Their urban living is very hip again. Cities are booming. It's kind of a nice renaissance. What we also see with that, however, though, is the gentrification pressures that are pushing those of lesser means out of their neighborhoods and into surrounding counties. And in fact, poverty is now, as I recall, in the Richmond region, poverty is greater in Chesterfield and Henrico counties than it is in the city of Richmond. And so I hate to say it, but it kind of makes me think of Nelson from The Simpsons when he says, ha ha. I mean, they kind of created this in a way by freezing cities and declaring themselves immune. Nobody wants to work across their local boundary lines, and decades later, this is the outcome. I try to use an analogy now where it's like each local government is its own sandbox. Everybody wants to just play in their own sandbox, but meanwhile, it's like, hold on a sec, there's an entire playground that we should really be taking advantage of and playing together, but yet we don't really get that often. So I guess with all of that, I would say that now that you're seeing some of these service delivery demands increasing in places like Chesterfield and Henrico, maybe the conversation can change a little bit more. I know there's been discussion and some activists here in the Richmond region that have talked about creating a regional school system or a regional magnet school that would be intentionally socioeconomically diverse, so that you overcome many of the issues that segregation and, by extension, this annexation moratoria has created. I would say we are stuck with this system as long as the powers that be remain the way they are. Quite frankly, in some cases, it's kind of sad, but when I've attended General Assembly sessions, there are a lot of legislators that don't get it, and they don't even get fundamentals about local government structure in Virginia. I've attended committee meetings before where I've heard a legislator say, oh yeah, that city is in that county. And it just makes you want to bang your head against the wall, because it's like, no, that is not true. They are completely separate. But historically, you used to have legislators who would start at the school board level, then go on to their local governing body, and then move on to being a delegate or a senator. And now that's not always the case. I haven't looked at it recently, but I don't think most legislators at the General Assembly have local government background. And that's really important. And it's especially important in a place that's a Dillon rule state, which I know I didn't speak to, and shame on me for not mentioning that. But a Dillon rule state essentially is a legal interpretation where local governments only have those powers that are explicitly granted to them or implied behind that explicit granting of power. Beyond that, they can't do it. And if there's any question or ambiguity of whether or not they could do this particular kind of service, they can't, which means they have to go to the General Assembly and have 140 legislators review their legislative request for power, and so, or for a particular power. And so then suddenly something that is an issue that may be of importance to Salem, Vinton, Roanoke, or Roanoke County, or the region entirely, is now something that is under the review and opinion of legislators from Northern Virginia, Southwest Virginia, the Eastern Shore, Hampton Roads, everywhere. And so then that gets particularly challenging too.
David,
Any other questions?
Kathy Greenberg had a question, but she was waving physically, so
Oh.
you might not have seen her.
No, I didn't. But yeah, Kathy, please go ahead.
And Kathy, you're on mute.
I'm just curious. So in your opinion, if Virginia, I think we have 41 independent cities or something like that, and only state, of course, with this setup. Are we idiots or are we geniuses?
Yeah. So it's 38 independent cities. There used to be 3 others, but they have reverted. That was Clifton, Forge, South Boston, and Bedford. So 41 is actually historically accurate. But yeah, now we're down to 38, maybe down to 37 soon. There is some merit to the independent city status, in that it's a lot clearer who is accountable at the local level for the services that are being delivered to you. If you go to a place like Pennsylvania or Illinois, good luck, because there are thousands of different types of local governments or political subdivisions that are spread across the state that have a variety of different service responsibilities. And so it can be very difficult to navigate. So the simplicity is very good for Virginia. I think a lot of people also argue double taxation, in that, you know, if you're a City of Roanoke resident, you're only paying City of Roanoke taxes. If you're a Roanoke County resident, you're only paying Roanoke County taxes. You're not paying both. I think there is some merit to that, but not exclusively, especially from more of a socioeconomic equity perspective of, you know, the haves versus the have-nots, and how we have essentially segregated in a way, you know, people in central cities, and the tax base is left, and there's little way to pay for that with local dollars, let alone state dollars, which oftentimes do not flow to localities in a sufficient manner.
Thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions for David? And you might, if you use the raise your hand feature, the virtual one, you'll pop up on the screen so you can see you. It's hard to see everybody at one time. All right, there's a question.
Yeah, I'm from Harrisonburg, and I very much appreciate the presentation you've given. It's been illuminating. I have 2 questions. One, broad historical sweep. The degree of participation of the federal government in revenue sharing with states changed in between the 70s and 80s. I wondered to what extent that impacted the arc that we're on. And then the local perspective, you've talked a little bit about Roanoke. Can you talk a little bit about Harrisonburg, where I live? What were the interests of Delegate Wilt? What were the conflicting motives, and what role were we playing in this process? And I'll pause at those. Thank you.
Sure, of course. Gosh, the federal question, that wasn't something that we really looked at. So I don't know if I'd really be able to answer that question for you, but certainly something worth examining. As far as Harrisonburg and Rockingham County are concerned, let's see. So I know that the former city manager, Kurt Hodgson, was one of our stakeholders. And then Stephen King was is the county administrator. Stephen was relatively new to his position when he joined our stakeholder group. It was actually his predecessor. Oh gosh, I want to say his name. I can't think of his name. He was actually the one who requested the study, which is kind of funny to request a study and then retire and not participate in the stakeholder advisory group. So I think Stephen had some big shoes to fill. But I will say that I think I can at least speak to Harrisonburg's perspective. From what I recall, again, when you can't grow physically your corporate limits, but yet you are a city like Harrisonburg that has had explosive population growth, and you're faced with providing K-12 schools, something as simple as finding a site for a new school becomes really challenging. The remaining land that is available is probably not ideal, and nobody wants to develop on it. So then you're faced with having to use something like eminent domain, or just a simple acquisition of private land to build the school, which then means you're taking that off of your local tax base. So it's just a really ugly situation. And of course, again, that was back in 2016 when Kurt was sharing that with us. So I don't know where that matter went, but I would imagine it's still, a struggle for Harrisonburg. I think a good best practice for Harrisonburg and Rockingham County to consider would be some sort of contractual consolidation of their school division. And there's examples of that in other parts of the state. The best probably being between the city of Williamsburg and James City County, where the two governing bodies of the school system still exist, but from an operational standpoint, the student body is going to schools across a broader geographic area. So maybe that's a solution for Harrisonburg to consider, Harrisonburg and Rockingham. But again, there's a lot of obstacles to doing that, all that local identity that I mentioned. Any other questions? And did that answer enough of your question? I know you were asking for something related to Delegate Wilt, and I can't really say much else about where he wanted to go with that. I think that we briefed him on the study. We worked with Chad Funkhauser, his legislative aide, and they did their best to carry the ball down the field. But I as far as I understand, I think they've kind of it's died a slow, quiet death now. All of those recommendations, like many studies that go to the General Assembly.
It looks like the Yates have a question.
Yeah, I mean, I just wondered what you think of what is the future of annexation in Virginia? I mean, I'm a kind of a Connecticut Yankee here, but I mean, I've always wondered about Roanoke City, Roanoke County, and Vinton and Salem, and it's always been a puzzle to me that we're not working together, being so.
Yeah. It's funny, a random board game humor. So when I was working on this study, a friend of mine introduced me to this board game called Settlers of Catan. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but you have settlements, you have cities, and you have metropolises, if that's the plural word. And I oftentimes thought, why aren't we advocating for or granting the ability for our communities to be aspirational and do something that's sexy and awesome sounding above and beyond being a city? The Virginia Constitution already grants local governments the ability to form into a regional government. It's something that's never been exercised before, but I think the future of annexation in a badass way would be for the communities to recognize that they are better and stronger together than they are apart. And maybe there's even a way where the cities and towns and counties can still exist, but then you have this other layer, this metro government that is able to call some shots and pull some strings and has a degree of credibility that would advance the community's best interests. Because I think that oftentimes, I mean, it just is what it is, but local officials don't want to give up their power. And so who, from a logic perspective, is going to say, okay, we're going to dissolve Vinton, and we're going to dissolve Salem, and we're going to dissolve Roanoke. We're all going to fold into Roanoke County. You've got, 15 plus individuals, not even counting the constitutional officers, your sheriffs, your treasurers, your commissioners of the revenue, Commonwealth's attorney, and I think there's a fifth one that I'm forgetting, but they all have such an interest in staying in power. And you can even see that occurring right now with Martinsville's reversion, because Martinsville's commissioner of the revenue is one of the people leading the charge against Martinsville's reversion. But another element to that is the citizens actually have some degree of power. There's a provision in state statute that I think gives, I want to say it's 5% of the registered voters in locality the ability to initiate a local government consolidation. So it's possible, but you're also dealing with a very complicated subject. And so it's hard to get the average citizen to understand a lot of these matters. And in this era of smartphones where everybody just wants to scroll, they're missing, all of the important matters at the local level, the matters that make the most difference.
And remind me what you were saying about the annexation moratoria. I didn't understand that.
Early on, what I was
early
saying,
on.
Yeah, so there was a compromise that was made by the General Assembly in 1987. After years of litigation between cities and counties, they came up with the Annexation Compromise, and that basically said, we will follow this formula in statute and give any locality that has a police department, not a sheriff's office, but a police department. Police departments are more common in cities and towns than they are counties. But we will follow this statutorily prescribed formula, give you this money under the condition that the annexation moratorium remains, which means nobody gets to grow. And so they did that for a little while, but they've backed out on the promise dozens of times, and you can see it carved out in statute, the number of biennia where they say, oh, not this biennium and not this biennium and not these future 6 biennium. We're not going to promise to fund you that money. Okay. So that's the compromise, but is it really?
Yeah, thank you.
You're very welcome.
Even with a big surplus.
Exactly. Although I think they may have funded it this time, but then if you think of the lost funds or the funds that would have been obligated, somebody's crunched the numbers before, and I believe it's in the hundreds of millions of dollars that cities, towns, and urbanized counties have been shorted by the General Assembly in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And any other questions for David? I'll scroll through and see if I see anybody else popping up. Wow, I tell you, okay, this just made me more and more interested. I just got, you know, I'm very interested in it, and I'm also interested in, you know, I like the way there at the end where we were headed, thinking a little bit about the things that communities can do, and how we can be creative. And Bill mentioned, you know, the water authority and the greenway, and God love the greenway. You know, everybody can touch it. They get out on it, they experience it. We are transforming, I believe, as a community because of it. And it connects us. So projects like that help us, you know, kind of inspire us to do more together, and I think can be terrific. Do you have any other examples of communities or regions that are organizing really well that way, and some things we might learn from them?
Yeah, two examples, actually. Thanks, Doug. One would be as it relates to the Dillon rule, which I explained to you all earlier, you know, where local governments only have the power that the legislature gives them, the state legislature. West Virginia has started experimenting with a pilot home rule program where some of their cities and towns are given a limited but still broader degree of freedom to govern at the local level than what would otherwise be given to them. And I think that allows for a lot more ingenuity, creativity at the local level. And I mean, local governments should really be the kind of engines of ingenuity. And why are we round peg square holing all of them to fit into this one size fits all mentality? It just doesn't make sense. So that's one example. The other example, I can't remember the name of the community. It's one of the successful local government consolidations. Oh gosh, I wish I could remember where it was. But I think it's also, it's all about how you sell local government consolidation. A lot of times reversion or consolidation are sold to the public as being, y'all, we're poor. We don't have enough money. The school buildings are crumbling. We're gonna have to fire a lot of people. Your trash is gonna get picked up every other week rather than every week. It's a mess. We've got to consolidate, or we've got to revert. What this community did, and I can't remember who it was, but they basically said, y'all, if we consolidate, we will become the 20th largest city in the United States. And that is a huge selling point because it puts us on the map when, you know, corporations look at those lists. And I mean, it's basics like that, but it makes a huge difference. For example, locally, City of Richmond, we're about 220,000 people. And then Chesterfield and Henrico are both over 300,000 apiece, let's say 350,000. So you've got 700,000 plus 250,000. So you've almost got 1 million people in just those three localities. And people who don't understand local government structure in Virginia, when they're doing their homework, they're like, City of Richmond's only 220,000 people. Why would I go there? That's small town. But it's like, no, we're massive. We're a huge metro area. So anyway, huge selling point in that regard. And so sometimes I think it's just a matter of focusing on what the positives could be rather than even, I mean, maybe you have to acknowledge the negatives, but that shouldn't be the driving force. It should be something that is aspirational. It's like, how can we be visionary and do something totally badass? So
excellent. Let's be totally badass.
Yeah.
Those are great words to end on. So everybody, if you can unmute, I'd love to give a round of applause for our guest, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. What a treat tonight was. I'm inspired to learn more, and that's what any good engagement is really about, right? Anytime you open a book and you read it and it makes you more interested in the topic, you know it was the right read. And so thanks for being our book tonight, David. We really appreciate it. And keep your eyes open. When Marissa and I put our heads back together again, I know we've got some suggestions for the next book to read, and we'll continue down our path of kind of exploring equity and engagement at the intersection of books and place. And thank you very much, everybody, for being with us tonight.
Of course,
And
I put my email in the chat if anybody ever needs to reach me. If you have other thoughts, I totally nerd out about this all the time. So email me anytime.
Excellent. And I'll send those out. I'll send that out to folks. Yeah. Great. Thanks, everybody.
Good night.